Hi, this is Professor Higgins, and welcome to week 12 of Business Organizations class. This week, we are going to be focused on the management of corporations. And specifically in this lecture, we're going to talk about how the shareholders, what the rights and responsibilities of the shareholders are. Last meeting or last lecture, we discussed the corporate structure, and we learned that there are shareholders that are the owners of the corporation that elect the directors. And there's the board of directors that elect the officers who run the day-to-day of the corporation, the day-to-day stuff. The major mission and the impetus of getting things done, although it comes from the board of directors, it's actually put into play, and a great deal of the decision making goes to the officers. Today we're going to be talking about the rights that the shareholders have as owners of the corporation and the responsibilities. All of this is set out in the notes that I have given you, and there's no holes in the notes. I have given you basically my lecture notes because I want you to really read them and then absorb them during the lecture as we go through these and talk about these. And I really want to hit the highlights, say that if you have any questions about this stuff, that as I go through the highlights, you can email me or we can talk about it on Tuesday during Tuesday talk time. Your notes are complete. I'm going to go over the highlights in a conversational manner, so we're going to be going pretty quickly. You don't need to write anything down, but I would like for you to supplement your notes. Places that if I say something that makes it a little more clear for you, I want you to have that. And then also, if you have a question about something, make a quick note of it so that you can email me later or that we can discuss it when we have our Zoom session. All right, the shareholders. A shareholder is a part owner of a corporation. You can own many different corporations all at the same time. If you buy one share of Disney, one share of General Motors, one share of Schwab, it doesn't matter. You can be an owner of as many different companies as you want to, or corporations as you want to. The requirements for becoming a shareholder are basically anyone can be a shareholder. You can be an individual or you can be an entity, a business entity. There are restrictions, remember, for professional associations. You have to be a professional in that profession in order to become a shareholder in a professional association corporation. And as far as S-corps, you have to be a U.S. citizen and you have to be an individual. You cannot be a business entity. So for S-corps and for professional associations, there are restrictions. But other than that, anyone can become a shareholder of any corporation unless that corporation stipulates to something specifically in their bylaws. All right. Let's take a look at all of the shareholder rights because there are a number of them. There's going to be 5, in fact, that I want to talk about. They are governed by statute, by Florida statute. There are the Articles of Incorporation also govern the shareholders' rights as well as the bylaws of the corporation. So the first right that a shareholder has is a right to inspect the books of the corporation. Every shareholder has that right, and every shareholder's attorney has that right. You have to give notice. You have to say, hey, I want to look at the books. But if you give them, if they have to make them available to you within a reasonable amount of time if you are a shareholder. Um, you have a right to inspect the books, the records, the articles, the bylaws, any resolutions, minutes, the names and addresses of the directors and the officers, and the annual reports. So shareholders have access to all of that at really any time they want, but they have to be they have to be produced, and sometimes they're produced online. Sometimes you have to come down and look at the physical, whatever the corporation has. That's how you get a copy of them. They can mail them to you, but you do have a right to see them. The courts will look at whether the shareholder, if the corporation says, no, I don't want to give this stuff to you, you can take them to court. And the court will look at whether or not you are asking for the books for a proper purchase. You want to look at all of this stuff for a proper purchase. You want to make sure that they are following the law, that they're not breaking the law, that they're treating their shareholders correctly, or that they are fiduciary. They have a fiduciary duty, and that they are following that. If you have a proper purpose for seeing the books or any of the other records, then you can do that. They may require that you give them 5 days written notice, but once you do that, you have access to the records. All right, the second right that a shareholder has is the right to sue. Now, you can have a direct suit, which is an action on behalf of the shareholders, of the shareholder, for injury to the shareholders. So, shareholders can sue the corporation. The other type of shareholder suit is a derivative action. When an action by a shareholder on behalf of the corporation occurs, when management has abridged the duty owed to the corporation and the corporation fails to enforce its own cause of action. So those two types of suits are the ones that you should really pay attention to. We discussed those in, I believe we discussed those in our very last business entity. The members can have derivative suits, the limited liability company. Okay, I also want you to take a look at Florida Statute 607.07 for open parens 0, 1, close parens, that states, in order for a shareholder to bring a derivative action in Florida, the following must apply. The person must have been a shareholder when the transaction complained of occurred. The shareholder has to make a demand to the board of directors, and that demand must have been refused or ignored, that demand being, I want you to file suit. And third, the suit must be in the best interest of the corporation. If all of those things are met, if all of those qualifications are met, then in the state of Florida, the shareholder may file a derivative action. The third right, we've kind of talked about this one as well. The third right are the presumptive rights. These are rights given to the shareholder, which give the shareholder the opportunity to protect their position in the corporation by granting them the right to purchase newly issued shares of the corporation's stock in an amount proportionate to their current stock ownership. So if you own 30% of the shares right now, and they come out with 100 more shares, you get the right of first refusal. You get to purchase those 30 of those new shares, 30 of those new stocks, and if you don't want them, then you let them, you release them, and then whoever wants to buy them can. But you get to retain the current position that you have, proportionate, and you get that same piece of the pie, even though there's going to be more shares out there. And we have a statute on that. Florida Statute 607.0630 says that shareholders only have presumptive rights if they are provided in the articles of incorporation. So you need to make sure that if you want to keep if you want preemptive rights in future stocks, then you need to make sure that your articles of incorporation allow it. Let's see, the next right is a big one. The shareholders have voting rights. A shareholder may indirectly control the corporation through their voting rights. They generally vote on the following matters: election and removal of the directors. That's the biggest one. This usually occurs annually, and they vote people in, they vote people out, and in that way they try to influence the direction of the corporation. The second one is to amend the articles or the bylaws. Shareholders can do this in the state of Florida. The third one is to vote on major corporate actions, or what we call fundamental changes. The sale of certain assets, a merger with another company, consolidation, or dissolution of the corporation. Those are all things that the shareholders would vote on. In order to hold a vote, you must, in order for the corporation to hold a vote, you must have a quorum. So there has to be at least a third of the shareholders voting in any big decision. The majority of shareholders is a quorum, but in no event shall a quorum consist of 1/3 of the shares entitled to vote. So you have to have at least a third or more. And there's two types of voting. There's straight voting, and there's something called cumulative voting. Now, in straight voting, if you have however many issues there are to vote on, and usually because it's directors, you're voting directors in or you're voting directors out, for each director position, if I have 100 shares, I would get 100 votes. So I can vote my 100 shares for this guy or 100 votes against this guy. The next guy, I could vote 100 votes for him or 100 votes against him. The next guy, let's say, is a female. We could vote 100 shares for her or 100 shares against her. That's called straight voting, when you have the number of shares, and per item to be voted on, you get that number of shares. Cumulative voting is when, let's say, we have the same 3 individuals. They are up for election or re-election, and so you get 100, 100, 100 for this particular election, and you decide to take all 300 of your shares and vote them for the female. That is a way that minority voters, if you're in a minority position where, let's say, everybody else tends to have 150 shares, so my 100 shares is never going to override that. I can take all of my 100 and put 300 on one single issue, and because that issue is maybe more important to me, then I can use that. And this type of voting makes sure that minority shareholders get to have a say. It's called cumulative voting. A shareholder would have a total of 300 votes to cast rather than just 100 per. Then we have some other unusual structures in voting, and these have to be in your bylaws in order to use them. There's something called class voting, and you may have this type of voting if different classes of stock exist. You vote with your class, like only the A shares are voting, and so every Class A share gets to vote. And maybe I have Class B share stock, so I do not get to vote. Maybe B and C are allowed to vote, but A is not voting on this. So when it's differentiated by classes, then you have what's called class voting. Contingent voting. Some shares vote only if certain things happen. For example, a A shareholder can vote for a director only in the years where dividends are not given. So let's say everyone receives a $100 dividend for every share that they have this year. If you have this type of contingent voting, when you vote only when you don't get a dividend, then you don't get to share. The feeling being that if people are getting their dividends, then they're going to be happy because they want to keep getting dividends. But if you're going 3 and 4 years with no dividends, you might want to, after the first year or two, you have the opportunity to vote some of these directors out. Disproportional voting. Voting occurs when one class has a different voting power than another. So let's say I have Class B stock, and maybe everyone that has Class A stock, for every share they hold, they get 5 votes. Their vote counts 5 times as much as a regular vote. I'm Class B stock, and maybe my vote, my shares only count 2 votes. So for every share I have, that's 2 votes for a certain issue or against a certain issue. And then there's something called non-voting stock. Non-voting stock usually is the least expensive. If you want to be part of a company and you want to own some stock, and you think that they're going to make money, but you can't really afford to buy a lot of the stock, you can buy non-voting shares, and you're given no voting rights that are associated with your stock. But when there are dividends to be paid out, you get dividends. Or when the stock increases in value, your stock increases in value. The only downside is that you don't have a say. But some people don't care. They don't want to follow business. They don't care about business. They just watch companies that do a great job. And if they're making money, they'll go ahead and they'll buy the non-voting stock because they just want to make a bit of the profit of that company. And then there is something called voting by proxy. Now, voting by proxy is it's when a shareholder who's not able to attend the shareholder meeting but really wants to vote on it, they give someone else a proxy. A proxy is an authorization given by a shareholder to another to have that person vote for him or her. There's 2 different kinds of proxies. There's a general proxy that says, okay, I am going to ask you to be my proxy, and I want you to vote on anything that comes up. You will have my general proxy, and I have 112 shares, so please vote my 112 shares and use your best judgment on anything that comes up. That is a general proxy. A specific proxy or a limited proxy means that I'm going to give you my 112 votes, and I want you to vote for me, but I want you to vote on a limited number of matters, and I don't want you to use your best judgment. I want you to vote in a specific way. I want you to cast these votes for me for whatever the issue is. My 112 votes will be, yes, I want this issue to pass. I'm not giving you freedom to vote the way you want, and I'm telling you which things to vote on. And if anything else comes up and you don't have a proxy that I've signed for you to vote my shares, then you can't vote. You just sit there and my 12 shares don't get voted. Okay. In order for this to work, there's a statute in Florida statute, and it is 607.0722, and it requires that there's a written document called an appointment form that the proxy has showing that the person who owns the shares has given that right for the proxy to vote their shares. Okay. A proxy may be revoked by shareholders unless the appointment form conspicuously states that it is irrevocable and that the appointment is coupled with an interest. So generally, when you have the appointment form, and generally it's a limited proxy, and so usually it's for a specific vote in a specific way on a specific item. All right. voting trust. Now, sometimes shareholders want to increase their power. And so they all get together and they give their right to vote to a trustee. This also has to be in writing, but it's where rather than having a proxy, you may actually be there, but you're going to give this trustee the right, and they are voting not only your shares, but they're voting a bunch of different shareholders, and so they usually have quite a bit more influence. Voting trusts can be very scary for corporations because sometimes they get very large. A voting trust is regulated under Florida Statute 607.0730, and it's defined as a group of shareholders with common interests that form a voting trust. It's an agreement between the shareholders and a trustee whereby the rights to vote the stock are transferred to a trustee. Everything else, all the other stock ownership rights and privileges and stuff, they're retained by the shareholder. But their rights to vote, if they give it to a trustee, then he votes for that giant block of people, or shareholders, I should say. Now, there's also something that if you don't want to have a trustee, you can also do the same thing, the same exact thing, with a voting agreement. Let's see. A voting agreement, or a shareholder agreement is a written agreement where two or more shareholders agree that they will vote their shares for one or more specific purposes. So, when you have shares that you decide to become part of a voting agreement, a shareholder agreement like this, you have to write them on the actual stock shares so that if I were part of a voting trust or a shareholder agreement, a voting agreement, then whoever I sell my shares to would know that these shares are going to be voted by someone else, unless that has been revoked, and then it's inconsequential. All right. The fifth right of a shareholder, the right to receive a dividend if one is declared. In Florida, the directors must use good faith in determining whether it is appropriate to declare a dividend. Okay, the board of directors decides whether or not to give the shareholders a dividend. I love this because you think of the shareholders as the owners and that they have elected these directors, and then the board of directors decide whether they get a dividend every year. They have to use their best business judgment. Shareholders always are looking and wanting the dividend. But basically, a corporation must be able to pay its debts and continue to fully function as the debts come due and not turn insolvent just because they tried to pay dividends. So the shareholders are the ones that have to keep the company solvent and make sure that they don't go belly up. If they're giving out dividends like crazy just to be popular, Florida will pull them back. Florida regulates that and says, no, you can't give all these dividends because you can't pay your bills now. So you have to make sure that your business judgment is up and running. Okay. Those are all the rights of the shareholders. Now let's talk about all the rights or all the responsibilities of the shareholders. This is great because basically there's no responsibilities of the shareholders. In general, shareholders have no fiduciary duty to the corporation other than paying for the stock. They have to pay for the stock, and thereafter they may act in their own personal interest. So I might buy stock in Costco, and then I might go over and might buy more stock in their competitor, BJ's. And then I decide to go buy some of Sam's stock. And then after the pandemic, I say, you know what? People are buying in bulk and they're even doing it on Amazon. I'm going to buy some stock in Amazon. I can buy in that whole sector because I believe in it, that section of business that I think is really going to make some money, because I'm trying to make money. I don't have to think, oh, it's bad for me to put money in Sam's when I am a part owner in Costco. No, as a shareholder, you do not have a fiduciary duty. You don't have to be fiscally dedicated or responsible to one corporation. Okay, so shareholders basically have to pay for their shares, basically have to pay for their stocks, and they really don't have much responsibility beyond that. Number 4, personal liability of a shareholder. Now remember, hundreds of years ago, corporations were put into place so that shareholders could be protected from personal liability. So the personal liability of a shareholder is nothing unless remember, if the corporate veil is pierced, and we went over that in one of our previous lectures, or if the shareholder grants a personal guarantee of debts of the corporation. So if we're starting out a brand new corporation, and while we're trying to put it up, while we're trying to take out loans to start the corporation, the bank says, no, this is a new corporation. I don't know anything about you. I'm not sure about this. And I say, please give the corporation a loan, and I will personally guarantee it, that if the corporation doesn't pay you back, then I will pay you back. If you have worked out an arrangement like that with the bank, of course, then the shareholder will be personally responsible. But outside of that, and outside of piercing the corporate veil, shareholders, they have absolutely no exposure to personal liability. Okay, shareholder meetings. There is a mandatory annual meeting of shareholders, and Florida statute requires this under Chapter 607. It's 607.0701. They're required to have one. The main purpose is to elect directors and any other business directors, any other business that those directors bring to the floor. And the time that it happens is stated in the bylaws. It can be anywhere. You don't even have to have your shareholder meeting in the United States. You can have it outside of the United States. You can have it in any state you want. Doesn't matter where you're incorporated. But remember, you must give notice. Notice, they call it the pain in the neck statute, so that make sure that your corporation, when it does give notice, that it also sends out the waiver of notice. Because if you have that waiver of notice signed, then you're fine. You still want to give notice, but that way if there's people who fall through the cracks, you're fine. Okay, in Florida, attendance is allowed via remote communication. Yes, and including internet video conferencing. And of course, Delaware was the first one to start doing that. I would suspect that by now, since we have gone through the COVID-19 pandemic, that all corporations are allowing that. Okay, so you have annual meetings for the shareholders once a year, and then you also can have special meetings. These occur when the board of directors or any other person, if it's stated in the articles, says if they call one. It can occur if more than 10% of the shareholders sign, date, and deliver to the corporation secretary a written demand describing the purpose. It can happen inside or outside of Florida, and you have to have notice to all the shareholders. All right. Some of the modern trends. The biggest thing, I think, is that shareholders can vote by phone or by e-proxy voting or mail. So you don't have to show up at the meeting. That used to be very important. These new regulations help reduce printing and postage cost, and estimates to save corporations as a whole about $1 billion a year. So all publicly traded companies are required to post their proxy material online, and then provide shareholders with the notice of the availability of materials at least 40 days before the meeting. So the shareholders, it's so easy now. It's so easy now to be involved with the shareholder meetings and to place the correct votes. All right, we're going to stop here, and I will pick up next time. I will continue this lecture, and we'll talk about the rights and responsibilities of both the directors and the officers. I know you cannot wait. I'll see you very soon.